Our story begins with a young woman named Gabrielle Bompard, born on August 13th, 1868, in the stunning city of Lille, located in the far north of France. If you've never been to Lille or seen pictures, it's a place of breathtaking beauty, with its ornate architecture, bustling markets, and a rich textile heritage that made it a jewel of the region. But for Gabrielle, Lille wasn't just a pretty backdrop. It was the stage for a childhood marked by sorrow and upheaval. She came into the world during a time of change in France, just a few years before the Franco-Prussian War would shake the nation, and her early years were anything but stable. When Gabrielle was only 13, tragedy struck. Her mother passed away. Losing a parent at such a young age is devastating for anyone, and for Gabrielle, it meant being left in the care of her father, a metal dealer who made his living trading goods in Lille's industrial circles. Her father wasn't a wealthy man, but he provided for his daughter as best he could, at least until his life took a new turn. Sometime after his wife's death, he began a relationship with a mistress, and soon, this woman moved into their home. Imagine being Gabrielle in that moment, a grieving teenager suddenly sharing her space with a stranger who'd taken her mother's place. It's no surprise that tensions brewed, and her father, perhaps unsure how to handle his strong-willed daughter, made a drastic decision. He sent Gabrielle away to boarding school, hoping a structured environment might set her on a better path. But boarding school didn't tame Gabrielle. It unleashed her rebellious streak. She was a handful, constantly getting into trouble, breaking rules, and clashing with authority. Teachers and headmasters described her as a girl with a lying disposition, a phrase that paints a picture of someone who couldn't or wouldn't stick to the truth. Each time she misbehaved, she was shuffled off to a new school, like a hot potato no one wanted to hold on to for long. You can almost see her, a defiant figure in a starched uniform, smirking as she was marched from one institution to the next. This cycle of defiance and relocation went on for years, wearing thin her father's patience until he reached his breaking point. Fed up with the endless reports of her misconduct, Gabrielle's father turned to a more extreme measure. He arranged for the authorities to step in, and they placed her in a corrective institute, a sort of reform school meant to reshape wayward youths into model citizens of French society. These institutes were harsh places, steeped in discipline and routine, designed to break spirits as much as build character. For Gabrielle, though, it was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. The rules, the expectations, the moral lectures, they all seemed foreign to her. She couldn't wrap her head around what they wanted her to become, and so she languished there, counting the days until she turned 18 and could finally walk free. When Gabrielle was released from the institute, she returned briefly to her father's house in Lille, but the reunion was anything but warm. The rift between them had only widened, and with his mistress still in the picture, Gabrielle felt like an intruder in her own home. She was 18 now, technically an adult, and she wasn't about to stay where she wasn't wanted. So she made a bold move. She packed her bags, or whatever few belongings she had, and headed to Paris, the glittering capital of France, determined to carve out a life for herself. Paris in the late 1880s was a city of dreams and extremes. The Eiffel Tower was still under construction, a symbol of progress rising over a metropolis alive with art, fashion, and innovation. Cafes lined the streets, intellectuals debated in salons, and the wealthy flaunted their riches in grand theaters. But beneath the glamour lay a gritty reality: poverty, crime, and a survival of the fittest mentality that devoured the unprepared. For a young woman like Gabrielle, with no money, no family support, and no connections, Paris was less a land of opportunity and more a lion's den. She arrived wide-eyed and hopeful, but it didn't take long for the city's darker side to notice her. Alone and vulnerable, Gabrielle became a target for the thieves and con artists who prowled Paris's shadows. They saw her as easy prey, someone naive enough to trust a friendly face, someone desperate enough to take risks. She struggled to find her footing, likely scraping by on odd jobs or charity, her dreams of independence fading with each passing day. That is, until she crossed paths with a man named Michel Ayrault, a meeting that would alter her fate forever. Let's shift gears and meet the other half of this infamous pair. Michel Ayrault was born on March 30th, 1843, in Saint-Étienne, a city in central eastern France known for its coal mines and industrial grit. He was 25 years older than Gabrielle, a man who'd already lived a lifetime of chaos by the time their paths converged. Michel's story begins in a France ruled by Napoleon III, a period of empire and ambition, and his early years hinted at a restless spirit unwilling to be tied down. As a young man, Michel joined the French army and was sent to Mexico during the Second French Intervention, a messy colonial campaign to install a puppet emperor. It was a brutal conflict, far from home, and Michel didn't stick around to see it through. He deserted, abandoned his post, and fled across the Atlantic to the United States, where he hid out until 1870. That year, an amnesty pardoned deserters, allowing him to slink back to France without facing a firing squad. You can imagine him stepping off the boat, a smirk on his face, already plotting his next move. Back in France, Michel tried to settle down. He got married, perhaps hoping to play the part of a respectable citizen, but he was a terrible husband, neglectful, indifferent, and quick to walk away. He abandoned his wife and spent the next 17 years drifting through life, a nomad with a silver tongue. Michel had a knack for languages, speaking several fluently, which he used to his advantage. He'd pose as a sophisticated gentleman, charming his way into the trust of wealthy marks, then swindle them out of their money with a smile. For nearly 2 decades, he lived this way, working odd jobs when he had to, conning people when he could, always one step ahead of the law. By the time he met Gabrielle in Paris, Michel was drowning in debt. His scams hadn't paid off as well as he'd hoped, and creditors were closing in. He was desperate, his charm wearing thin, his options running out. Then, along came Gabrielle, young, impressionable, and beautiful. To Michel, she wasn't just a pretty face. She was a lifeline, a partner in crime he could mold to his will. Michel didn't waste time. He turned on the charm, regaling Gabrielle with tales of his adventures in Mexico and America, painting himself as a worldly rogue who'd seen it all. For Gabrielle, who'd spent her life feeling unwanted and misunderstood, Michel's attention was intoxicating. He was older, experienced, and confident. Everything she wasn't. She fell for him hard, and soon she was his mistress, trailing beside him as they strolled Paris's grand boulevards, sipping coffee in bustling cafes and dining in dimly lit restaurants. Michel loved showing her off, a trophy on his arm, proof he still had his touch. But behind the scenes, his financial troubles were mounting, and he needed a way out. That's when the idea struck. A plan as old as crime itself, yet twisted with Michel's signature flair. He proposed that Gabrielle use her beauty to lure a wealthy man to an apartment, where they'd rob him and kill him, pocketing a fortune in the process. It was a cold-blooded scheme, but Michel had survived for years by staying ahead of the law, and he wasn't about to take chances now. Every detail had to be perfect. He started with the location. Michel told Gabrielle to rent a ground floor apartment, specifically ground floor, so the sound of footsteps, a struggle, or a body hitting the floor wouldn't echo to neighbors below. With the space secured, they took a trip to London, a bustling hub just across the channel, to gather their tools. There, they bought a large trunk, big enough to hold a man, a massive cotton bag, some sturdy rope, a pulley, and a length of silk cord. To anyone else, it might have looked like they were moving house or setting up a workshop, but Michel had darker intentions. Back in Paris, they headed straight to the apartment, and Michel got to work. He hammered the pulley into a sturdy crossbeam above, hung a heavy curtain across an alcove behind the bed, and positioned a chair behind it, his hiding spot. The plan was ingenious in its simplicity. Gabrielle would bring the victim into the room, flirt with him, maybe share a drink or two, then playfully slip the silk cord around his neck like a scarf. At that moment, Michel, concealed behind the curtain, would yank the rope attached to the pulley, hoisting the man off the ground and strangling him silently. It was a hands-off murder for Michel. Gabriel would be the bait, and he'd be the executioner, all without leaving a trace of his presence. With the trap set, Michel turned his attention to finding the perfect mark. He needed someone wealthy, someone who carried cash, and someone susceptible to Gabriel's charms. After some digging, he zeroed in on Auguste Gouffé, a 42-year-old widower living near the heart of Paris with his 3 daughters. Gouffé was a bailiff and process server, a job that put him in charge of collecting debts and serving legal notices, work that often left him handling large sums of money. He was cautious, never leaving cash in his office overnight, always taking it home to keep it safe. But there was one exception: Fridays. On Friday evenings, Gouffé had a routine. He'd head out into the city, maybe to a bar, maybe to see friends, leaving his money locked in his office, planning to pick it up the next morning. It was a small window of vulnerability, but for Michel, it was gold. If they could hit Gouffé on a Friday night, they might catch him with cash on hand, or at least get access to his office stash before he retrieved it. Auguste was ideal. A middle-aged man, widowed, likely lonely, and easily swayed by a young woman's attention. Michel had his target. The date was set, July 26, 1889, a warm Friday night in Paris. Auguste Gouffé, as usual, made his way to his favorite bar, a cozy spot where he could unwind after a long week. Little did he know, Gabriel was already there, positioned like a spider waiting for its prey. She was dressed to catch his eye, her demeanor warm and inviting. A few minutes after Gouffé settled in, she struck up a conversation, casual at first, then flirtatious. They shared drinks, laughed, and as the night wore on, Gabriel dangled the bait, an invitation back to her apartment for a private moment. Gouffé, perhaps flattered, perhaps eager, agreed. He followed her through the darkened streets to the ground floor apartment, stepping inside without a hint of suspicion. What happened next was swift and brutal. As planned, Gabriel lured him near the bed, the alcove and pulley hidden behind the curtain. She slipped the silk cord around his neck, maybe giggling as if it were a game. Then, Michel pulled the rope, or tried to. The pulley jammed, the mechanism failing at the worst moment. Panicking, Michel emerged from his hiding spot and took matters into his own hands, strangling Gouffé with brute force until the man went limp. They searched his body, expecting a windfall, but found only a watch and 150 francs, a pitiful haul for such a risk. Michel, undeterred, dashed to Gouffé's office later that night, hoping to find the rumored fortune. He rummaged through papers and drawers but missed the 14,000 francs tucked away behind some documents, leaving empty-handed. The plan had gone sideways, but the deed was done. Auguste Gouffé was dead, and they had to move fast. With a lifeless body in the apartment, Michel and Gabriel sprang into action. They stuffed Gouffé into the cotton bag, then crammed the bag into the trunk, a grim, frantic effort fueled by adrenaline. On July 27th, they hauled the trunk onto a train bound for Lyon, a city hundreds of kilometers south of Paris. There, they rented a vehicle and drove into the countryside, searching for a secluded spot. Near a wooded area, they dumped the body under a bush, hoping nature would hide their crime. Further down the road, Michel smashed the trunk to pieces, scattering the evidence. By July 29th, they were on the move again, boarding a boat from Calais to Dover, England. Michel traveled under the alias Monsieur Lebel, while Gabrielle, her hair cropped short, posed as his teenage son, a clever disguise to throw off suspicion. Days later, they boarded a transatlantic steamer to Canada, this time as Monsieur Van Aert and his daughter, Bertha. 8 days after that, they landed in Quebec City, their trail growing colder with every mile. While Michel and Gabrielle were hopping continents, thinking they'd gotten away clean, fate had other plans. In August 1889, a road worker in Vierzon, a sleepy city 500 kilometers south of Paris, was making his rounds when he spotted something odd, a large oilskin bag stuffed under a bush. Curiosity piqued, he opened it and recoiled in horror. Inside was a decomposing corpse, crammed into the bag like trash. The stench was overwhelming, and the sight was straight out of a nightmare. Local police arrived quickly, and on August 14th, an autopsy confirmed the worst. The victim had been strangled, likely 3 to 5 weeks earlier. But who was he? No one in Vierzon was missing, and the body was too decayed for an easy ID. Then, 2 days later, a second clue emerged. A broken trunk, abandoned nearby, reeking of death. Postal markings traced it back to Paris, hinting that this wasn't a local crime. Out of their depth, the Vierzon police alerted the Paris police, specifically Commissioner Marie-François Gourand, a detective known for cracking tough cases with a mix of grit and genius. Gourand took one look at the evidence and knew this murder started in Paris, and the killers had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. He was determined to uncover the truth. Identifying the victim was Gourand's first hurdle. With no leads in Vierzon, he turned to the public, sharing details of the body, the bag, and the trunk through the press. He even had the trunk repaired and planned to display it publicly. A bold move to spark recognition. As the story spread, rumors swirled about Auguste Gouffé, a Parisian bailiff who'd vanished in late July. His family was desperate for answers. Gouffé was a widower with 3 daughters, a man of routine. His sudden disappearance was unlike him. Police interviewed those closest to him, piecing together his final hours. On July 26, 1889, Gouffé had visited his usual bar, then disappeared. A hall porter at his office recalled a strange encounter that night. Around 9 p.m., a man had barged in, headed to Gouffé's office, and bolted out, shoving past when questioned. Inside the office, nothing was obviously missing. 14,000 francs remained hidden behind papers, but 10 half-burnt matches littered the floor, suggesting someone had fumbled in the dark. To confirm their hunch, Gourand ordered a second autopsy, armed with Gouffé's medical history from his family. Old injuries to his leg and ankle, dental records, and hair color all lined up. There was no doubt. The body in the bag was Auguste Gouffé. The question now was, who killed him? With the victim identified, Gourand shifted focus to the killer. Gouffé's job as a bailiff made him a target for resentment. Debt collectors rarely win popularity contests, but this murder felt too deliberate for a simple grudge. Gourand needed more. In a stroke of brilliance, he displayed the trunk at the Paris morgue for a week. Crowds flocked to see it, the press dubbed it the murder trunk, and the case became a sensation. Amid the chaos, a tipster mentioned Michel Ayrault, a known swindler who'd vanished from Paris around the same time as Gouffé. Digging deeper, police learned Ayrault had a young mistress, Gabrielle Bompard, and both had been MIA since July 29th, days after the murder. Gourand's gut told him he was onto something. He launched a full investigation into the pair, though progress was slow. The Gouffé family's 500-franc reward flooded the station with tips, most of them dead ends from reward chasers. Still, Ayrault's shady past and international connections suggested he'd fled France. Gourand had to think bigger. In December 1889, a letter from London landed on Gourand's desk. The sender, a boarding house owner, had read about the case and recognized 2 former guests, Michel Ayrault and a young woman named Gabrielle. They'd stayed in mid-July, leaving on July 14th for New Haven, then France. Crucially, the owner recalled Gabrielle buying a large trunk in London, almost empty when she returned with it. It was a bombshell. Gourand sent detectives to London, where they tracked the trunk to a shop on Euston Road. The shopkeeper confirmed a Frenchman had bought it on July 12th, identifying Michel from a photo. The boarding house owner's wife backed it up. The pieces were falling into place. Michel and Gabrielle had the trunk used to move Gouffé's body. But where were they now? Gourand knew Michel was a seasoned traveler, so he expanded the search. He alerted police in England, Canada, and the United States, sharing Michel's photo and the case details. Newspapers ran the story worldwide, turning Michel and Gabrielle into infamous fugitives. Meanwhile, the pair was living it up, or trying to. After reaching Quebec City, They'd moved through Montreal, Vancouver, and San Francisco, always on the move. In San Francisco, they met Georges Garanger, a wealthy Frenchman ripe for the picking. Michel saw another con, urging Gabrielle to charm Garanger for a big score in New York. She played along, traveling with Garanger to San Francisco while Michel planned to rendezvous later. But then, a twist. Garanger's genuine kindness disarmed Gabrielle. Unlike Michel, he saw her as more than a tool. Overwhelmed, she confessed everything. Michel's scams, the plan to rob Garanger, and Gouffé's murder. It was a turning point. Her first step off Michel's leash. Stunned, Garanger agreed to help Gabrielle escape Michel. She insisted on returning to France via Canada, perhaps sensing the end was near. As they traveled, she spilled her story, her tragic life, Michel's control, the murder she claimed to barely understand. Back in France, Goron got a shock on January 21st, 1890. A letter from Michel, mailed from New York. Michel claimed innocence, admitting he'd bought the trunk for Gabrielle, but insisting she sold it. He spun a tale of heartbreak and financial ruin, vowing to return if she did. Dreurs Goron saw through the lies. It was a desperate deflection. The next day, January 22nd, Gabrielle walked into the Paris police station, announcing herself. She'd ditched Garanger and come clean, admitting she lured Gouffé, but denying she knew he'd die. She portrayed herself as Michel's puppet, trusting the courts to see the truth. After signing her statement, she was arrested, and the press exploded. Gabrielle Bompard was in custody, but Michel was still out there. By mid-1890, Michel Ayrault was a wanted man across 3 continents. After fleeing France, he bounced from New York to Mexico, finally landing in Havana, Cuba, thinking he'd outrun the long arm of the law. But justice has a way of catching up. In June 1890, a fabric merchant in Havana spotted Michel and recognized him from the wanted posters circulating worldwide. This wasn't some high-stakes sting operation. It was a shopkeeper with a keen eye who brought down one of France's most notorious fugitives. The Cuban police arrested Michel, and France quickly arranged his extradition. Shackled and defeated, he was shipped back to Paris, where Commissioner Goron awaited. The global manhunt was over. Both Michel and Gabrielle were now in custody, and the stage was set for a trial that would become the talk of the town and beyond. On December 16, 1890, the Paris Assize Court opened its doors to what can only be described as the trial of the century. The courtroom was packed, reporters jostled for space, spectators lined up at dawn, and the air crackled with anticipation. Michel Ayrault and Gabrielle Bompard, once partners in crime, now faced off as defendants in a case that had it all: murder, betrayal, and a defense so wild it would make legal history. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted a vivid picture of the crime: Gabrielle luring Gouffé to the apartment with promises of romance, Michel rigging a pulley to hang him, and the chaotic moment when the plan failed, leading Michel to strangle Gouffé with his own hands. They detailed the aftermath: the paltry loot, the dumped body, the destroyed trunk, and the couple's flight across borders. It was an airtight case, they argued. Premeditated murder, plain and simple. Both deserved the guillotine, but the trial was about to take a turn no one saw coming. Gabrielle Bompard didn't just sit quietly as the prosecution laid out their case. She entered the courtroom like a celebrity, dressed in stunning gowns, her hair flawless, a smile dancing on her lips. Every day, she posed for the cameras, her image splashed across newspapers with headlines that softened her guilt. The public ate it up. This wasn't the monster they'd imagined. This was a tragic heroine, a young woman caught in a web spun by an older, sinister man. It was a performance worthy of the stage, and it set the tone for her defense. Then came the bombshell. Gabrielle claimed she'd been hypnotized by Michel. Yes, hypnotized. She argued that Michel had used his powers of suggestion to control her mind, forcing her to play her part in the murder. At a time when hypnosis was still a mysterious science, this was groundbreaking. Her lawyers brought in witnesses, people who'd known her as a child, who swore she'd always been prone to trances, slipping into hypnotic states with ease. One paper ran the headline, "Murder Under Hypnosis," and suddenly, the trial wasn't just about guilt. It was about whether Gabriel had any free will at all. The courtroom buzzed. Could Michel, a man of charm and cunning, have mastered hypnosis? Was Gabriel a puppet in his hands, or was this a clever ploy to escape punishment? The public was divided, but sympathy tilted toward her. At 21, she seemed too young, too fragile to be a cold-blooded killer. The hypnosis defense turned the trial into a spectacle, raising questions about coercion and responsibility that echoed far beyond the courtroom walls. Michel wasn't about to let Gabriel steal the spotlight, or his chance at mercy. He knew the evidence against him was damning. His fingerprints were all over the crime, figuratively and literally. But if he was going down, he'd take her with him. In a fiery counterattack, he accused Gabriel of being the real mastermind. She wasn't a victim, he said. She was a manipulative seductress who'd planned the murder and used him as her muscle. He was just a lovesick fool, too smitten to say no. It was a desperate play, and it didn't land. The jury saw Michel for what he was, a career criminal with a history of shady dealings, the man who'd built the pulley and finished Gouffé off when the plan unraveled. Still, his accusations muddied the waters, turning the trial into a dramatic showdown. Was Gabriel a hypnotized pawn or a cunning accomplice? The truth hung tantalizingly out of reach. After days of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone inside. When the jury returned, the foreman's voice cut through the tension. Michel Ayrault, guilty of murder. The judge sentenced him to death by guillotine, a verdict that surprised no one. Michael's face was grim but resigned. He'd known his odds were slim. Then came Gabriel's fate. Guilty, but with extenuating circumstances. The room erupted in gasps. Extenuating circumstances meant the jury believed something. Her youth, her past, or maybe that hypnosis story, lessened her culpability. Instead of death, she got 20 years of hard labor. It was a twist that left Michel fuming and Gabriel quietly triumphant. Justice had been served, but not in equal measure. Michael's story ended quickly. Despite appeals, he faced the guillotine on February 3, 1891. The blade fell, and the man who'd once dreamed of riches was gone. Gabrielle's path was longer. She served 15 years of her sentence, shuttled between prisons in Nanterre and Clermont, before being released in 1905 at age 37. By then, the case that had once set Paris ablaze had faded from the headlines. Gabrielle lived out her days in obscurity, dying sometime in the early 1920s. No one knows exactly when or where. The media frenzy was over and the world moved on, and that's the end of the saga of Michel Ayrault and Gabriel Bompard, a tale of greed, murder, and a defense that changed the game. But it leaves us with questions. Was Gabrielle really under Michel's spell? Or did she play the system like a pro? Was Michel the monster? Or was he too a victim of love gone wrong? And what about Auguste Gouffé, the forgotten man at the center of it all? This case lingers in the shadows of history, a puzzle we may never fully solve. Thanks for joining me on this wild ride. If you enjoyed it, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more stories like this. Drop a comment. What's your take? Was Gabrielle innocent, guilty, or somewhere in between? Could hypnosis really drive someone to murder? Let's talk about it. Until next time, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.